Итак, уважаемые дамы и господа,
Dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and I am ready to welcome all participants of our roundtable discussion, which is dedicated to tax inevitability. And today we'll speak about the prospects of entrepreneurship development in Russia and internationally, and we understand that the tax is a serious issue for every businessman. They consider that tax burden is excessive. On the state point of view, the tax is the main source of the budget, and we have two laws of federal and regional tax. And first, I would like to give the floor to the Minister of the government of Moscow, Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov. And Maxim, we would like to listen about the main trends and tax policy of the capital of Russia, the city of Moscow. Okay, very good. How much time I have? 10 minutes. Good. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to welcome everybody in this wonderful city of ours and tell you about the tax system which we have established here in this capital city and country in general. And because there are no colleagues on the federal level, therefore I will comment for them on issues which are directly pertain to the federal officials. But for those who are new for our tax environment, I will say that we have quite liberal, modern, and very well administrated branch, the tax system, which by all international assessments can be regarded as one of the best institutions built in our country, and the backdrop of other cities and countries, which looks quite appealing. And even last year, on order of this Ministry of Industrial Development, PricewaterhouseCoopers made a survey in 20 Russian cities, and judging by the tax burden and general approaches to taxation, Moscow is on the 15th place, and judging on the simplified form of taxation, we happen to be on the 8th place out of 20 biggest cities, and this is quite a good indicator. On the other hand, we need to understand the specificity of the Russian tax system, and the first thing to note is that the tax system, which is focused on ensuring profits of our budget under the setting of economic growth. So in Moscow, we have 45% of the profit tax of tax proceeds come from this profit tax of corporations. Therefore, we are well dependent on the economic setting, and therefore our social expenditures and become kind of vulnerable to economic situations. And tax administration is another issue. On the one hand, it is working quite well. On the other hand, the concentration of tax proceeds from a small number of largest corporations, raw material producing, mineral resources developing corporations, creates certain dependence. On the other hand, tax administration of small business is kind of neglected, and this leads to certain behaviors when fair businessmen pay, and those not absolutely fair avoid paying taxes and don't actually have any serious risk from tax authorities. And therefore, we have certain competition between fair-minded and there's entrepreneurs with those who cheat and therefore have certain advantages. And another point which we cannot ignore, our tax system is extremely poorly adapted, already quite conservative with regard to producing incentives to economic development. It means that the tax breaks in interests of the development of businesses, which it's widely, it's quite common across the Russian regions. On the other hand, the degree of tax breaks is not that sufficient to provide necessary incentives to the business community. Therefore, we believe that the current system has certain shortcomings, and knowing this, we declared a new tax policy in Moscow, which actually is focused on these three challenges. First is how to get reoriented from the profit tax in order to be independent from economic upheavals, and this is the transition to the real estate tax, which need to be more substantial, and it is international practices. And last year, the government of Moscow has adopted certain amendments at the federal tax code, which allowed us to change the tax systems for office and trade real estate. And all regions transited to taxing of real estate depending on the market value. And Moscow jumped on this opportunity, and we believe that in the first quarter of this year we will have a significant increment of 14 to 17 billion rubles. Our rough assessment is, and so far we don't see any faults in our evaluations, and we believe that this system is very promising, and only large objects, real estate, are covered by this, but we will continue expanding this approach, and I believe that those who are not in the picture of the Moscow specificity, Moscow has lost around 10% of tax profits due to change in rules of taxation of oil and gas industry. And the law which was on transfer pricing and changing this the rules and the innovations in the oil industry led to the redistribution of the tax proceeds in favor of other regions and some commercial companies. And this is the first area of our innovations in tax policy. And the second is related to the improvement of tax administration. And we are actively promoting this package model of taxing, issuing patents. And this is a quite simple system of taxing, which is quite clear, very well known for a taxpayer. And it's still a very good idea and an excellent idea, although we see certain obstacles in promoting the system further. And the first thing to mention is that the tax system depends on organizational setting. It means that the individual entrepreneurs can pay following this system, but these corporate systems don't have this chance. Therefore, we need to level this opportunity for small businesses. And the second thing is alternative ways of paying a patent or to pay tax in other forms, and like simplified forms, where it stays at 6% or 15% if it incorporates also profits and expenditures. And some entrepreneurs learned how to increase or reflate the expenditures and pay zero tax. And we believe that the patent system probably has certain advantage and become the dominant one. And therefore, if a person can buy a patent, then it will be mandatory for them to buy it. The experts believe that this option is most promising. And another thing is to be more flexible in evaluating this patent size, depending on the region of Moscow. And this is the second area of our efforts, which is related to leveling the tax burden on entrepreneurs, both fair and unscrupulous ones, to put them on the similar setting and to have tax unavoidable for them, although we understand that the tax burden which the entrepreneurs in Moscow feel, it is quite acceptable and even was very modest burden compared to the activities we have in the city. And related topics to the tax administration are as follows, and the entrepreneurs might be interested in it. There is a project launched by the federal tax authorities, which is related to the cash registration. And in Moscow, we have already new opportunities in issuing checks and controlling this cash proceeds for the internet, and certain alternative options are promoted by the federal tax authorities. And here we believe that a lot of costs can be avoided by entrepreneurs.
We're also planning to expand the use of tax instruments in order to foster economic activity. This will be done in the condition when we will tax the private individuals, and then we will see that the price and cost of these tax breaks increased significantly. Last year, we started the program of giving tax breaks to technoparks and technopolises, and both companies from Moscow and private companies are liable to apply for this status, and their property will be taxed at a more beneficial rate. And in exchange to that, they undertake an obligation to lure into the business a new type of investors. These are those investors who invest into production investment, invest into research and development activities. This is one of our tools one of our tax tools that we're planning to use more extensively in future. Drawing a line under all these proposals, I would like to say that our final task is to create a completely different economic basis for the development of the city, and this will be done through the use of tax instruments. We will change the profile of the city and create long-term jobs, and we'll also make sure that all social obligations are observed and development priorities are observed as well. This will help to create a stable tax base which will not depend on the economic conditions or position of huge corporations. Thank you very much. Mr. An, I would like to ask you. Now, Maxim has already noted that one of the most important tasks in front of the Moscow government is to create the potential and preserve the potential of innovation. And would you please tell us in a more detailed way about technoparks and similar mechanisms to that? I will briefly outline our approach to support of entrepreneurship. We are working together with various departments in the Moscow government, and we are also working on regulating tax instruments. And we are facing certain issues in this area. And in Russia, we do not have the highest tax rate as compared to Europe, for example, even if you compare it with average European taxes. It is all about the level of distribution, and it is all about the spreading the tax burden equally. Innovation setups and innovation enterprises they face a problem with funding in the first stage of their development. So they never have too much money. And when they just embark on their project, they keep an eye on every ruble they spend. In some cases, this tax burden increases their risks. This given the fact that in the course of the ramp-up stage, when the company starts to scale up its business, then it should face a certain tax burden. So they should have to pay more taxes than just startups. I'm not talking about increasing the tax burden for big companies now. My point is a little bit different. We have recently started a project related to technopolises and technoparks, and companies who operate in these technoparks sometimes pay zero taxes of certain categories. And we heard the word combination like tax on modernization, and this is applied when the company has to pay a tax on property and a tax on land, and it is applicable to Moscow because a lot of land is owned by the city, and as you know, the cadastral value of land has been increasing for a number of years, and it is getting closer to the market value of the land. So what we have to do, we have already zeroed these taxes for companies operating in technoparks and technopolises for a period of 10 years. And it serves to the benefit of the companies which build infrastructure, and serves to the benefit of the companies who reside in these technopolises. And they also don't have to pay the 4.5% of city tax. This is our way to send a message to business and to try and make them invest into these technoparks and take up space there. The tax is not used for just the purpose of using the tax, and the companies will only go there if there are labor resources available, if there is a good logistics, and if their markets are close by. So this tax part of this decision-making process is not always a decisive part of making a decision in favor of residing in a tax park, in a technopark. So we have to create some favorable conditions. There are elements which are regulated on the federal level, and they are regulated by the law about Skolkovo. In Skolkovo, there are special conditions created for the companies. So for a certain period of time, they are not paying labor taxes. And I think there is still a lot of things to be done in this area by the federal government and municipal governments as well. So in those cases, it is quite difficult to regulate the entire market that has hundreds of thousands of small companies and tens of thousands of medium companies. So it is quite a challenging task to administer all these taxes. But as far as technoparks are concerned, it is pretty straightforward. There is a transparent mechanism of tax administration and control over tax payments. And so we see that there is still a room for something to be done in alleviating the tax burdens for small innovational companies for the first 3 years of their operations. There are other ways to alleviate the tax, but however, the cost of labor in Moscow is quite high. So zeroing the labor tax can become a good stimulus for these companies to develop. And another thing is relating to industry. We discussed this issue with the economic ministry last year, and this ball is in our court, so we had to prepare calculations. We are working on finalizing these calculations, and we will have to define criteria for efficiency and productivity of companies operating in the city. We know that our industry is not growing, both in terms of numbers and volume, I mean, it's not growing in the city because some industries get relocated in other regions and some are just operating in inefficient manner. We have done an analysis of these companies' operations. So we tried to measure efficiency of using land, and this is a very hot issue for Moscow because land is very expensive. And we have also taken a look at productivity, and in a lot of cases our productivity in Russia is 3 or 4 times below productivity of Western companies or American companies. So our analysis shows that in comparable areas the KPIs, the figures are several times different. Like, for example, sausage production, Dimov. Well, we'll not give specific figures now, not to disclose your information, but Dimov's efficiency is higher than efficiency of other companies who are still operating. So these inefficient companies, they take up a lot of space. They provide some jobs, but they're not doing it in the right scale. So in the first stage of this work, we suggest that these companies should be getting some sort of support, like 1.5% reduction of the land tax or property tax. That will give them some emotional support. And some of these companies are already operating on the basis of 0.5% tax rate. Then, depending on their efficiency and productivity, if they become one of top 50 or top 10 companies, then they will be allowed to pay even less tax on property and land. And that will be administered by the property department. And then from then on, it becomes very straightforward. If you are above the certain threshold, you become automatically entitled to a different tax rate. For example, revenue per person. And we compare that with German, American, and French companies. In their cases, the figures differ very much depending on the industry, but it is from 8 to 9 million rubles per person a year. And if you take Moscow enterprises, then you will see 2, 3, or 4 at its best, 4 million rubles a year per person. So this year we are planning to introduce certain conditions, or a rule of the game, and then create the 5-year action plan so that this KPI will be brought up to the benchmark, let's say to the European level. So our entrepreneurs will see that they have a certain target to reach. Now they have time to ramp up their business, and if you modernize your business enough, then you'll be entitled to lower tax rate on property and land. If no, then you will have to choose. You will pay a higher tax, or alternatively, you will have to close your business down. That is still an option. And drawing a line after what I've said, tax burden is one thing. But another thing is efficiency and productivity, which is very important because productive enterprises do not have problems with paying taxes, apart from startups and innovation companies, because they are, for the first, they do not generate profit. So our major problem is related to tax administration, and we are getting a lot of questions from companies when they get claims from tax authorities, then they go to court, and then the tax authorities, the court reverses the decision of the tax authorities. However, the tax authorities have plan in terms of tax revenue generation. For example, Nokia, when Nokia lost the market share and was reformed, then the tax authority had Nokia in its plan. So certain people in this tax department, they would be behind the plan had they not collected the right amount of money. So they have taxed Nokia. Then finally Nokia got the court to reverse the tax authority's decision, so it's got its money back. But that creates unnecessary pressure on business, and it creates unnecessary expenses and costs for the business. Business has to maintain their own lawyers, or they have to outsource their legal consulting, which is good for lawyers, but that creates unpredictability in the business environment, which enhances business risk generally in the country. Am I right in saying that Moscow government generally wants all unproductive entities out of Moscow? This is the general point of view. This is how it is generally taken. Now, if you are saying that you are going to increase their tax rates, a majority of these companies have paid quite high tax, are paying quite high tax rate, but there is another part which have lobbied for lower tax rates, and they are paying a smaller tax rate now. We will be supporting all of them, but we will be creating soft stimulus. We will slightly put the target higher and higher on every year, so that these companies will have to work properly. So the support will be there for another 3 years. At least they will be entitled to nominal support from the state's side. And we are spending quite a lot of money for this stimulus. And for example, we've subsidized the refinancing rate for modernization. We subsidized 25% of some leasing cost. So all these mechanisms are there. So in return for investment, we have this program in car building industry. There's one thing to be mentioned here. We are for preserving the industrial profile of the city. We want industry to be in the city, but we are against the fact that large space inside the city is taken up by industrial entities, and they are not used actually for production. We have large industrial areas in our city, and everyone is keeping this land in expectation that they will have the building permit to build residential area there. This is why we are taxing the land, to make sure that the land is working to the benefit of the city, and these companies should have a clear understanding that if they are operating in the industrial area, they have to operate in line with all development plans. So they need to have a clear perspective. They need to know that there will be no residential areas in industrial zones. But yes, but at the same time, you say that only companies operating in technoparks and technopolises are entitled to tax breaks. Not every company wants to go there. We have a big number of companies who easily cope with the existing tax burden, including those companies who do require big space, like Avtoframos, for example. They've done the research, and they said that if we wanted to choose where to put this plant, they would have chosen Moscow anyway. Thank you, Maxim. And I would like to give word to Vladislav Korochkin. Vladislav, you are the first vice president of the pillar of Russia, OPORA ROSSII. Now we do understand in a better way the tax policy of the Russian government, but even they are saying that tax administration is the biggest problem for them. What is the biggest problem from the business perspective in the tax area? 12 years ago, when we just started this organization, the tax issue was the key issue for all sorts of business. Take, you name it, big business, small business, or medium business. And administration of taxes was a big part of this issue. And we always said that we cannot set up a system which would require to open a company, you will have to get a chief accountant, pay him a decent salary, and only then you will feel yourself protected. And you will be sure that you wouldn't have a situation when you will be jailed for making 3 mistakes in the tax rules. So that issue has now been resolved. I think that we have facilitated the introduction of certain tax rules in the tax code, like, for example, simplified taxation. And now we are working on the patent taxation, which is another step forward in terms of simplification of taxation. But however, for small business, it is still a big issue. So whatever relates to patent system is very important for us, and I think it will start working in a very efficient way if we carry on doing what we are doing. If we carry on simplifying and optimizing our tax administration system. And another thing to be said is about tax rates. Well, I wouldn't want to mention the opinion which everyone believes is wrong, that it was about increasing the social payments, that increase of social payments caused a lot of private individuals to close down their enterprises, and that issue was heavily debated in all forums last year. So, there is another thing to be said, like Mikhail has formulated the city policy in a very clear way, but I would like to add to his comment. He hasn't said enough about the need to build the competitive system, the system that will be in good competition with other regions and other jurisdictions. So when we talk about tax administration and tax rates, we should keep in our mind that, given informational transparency issue, we all understand which taxes are being paid in which area. For example, in Ulyanovsk area, they are paying 5% on this on their income, or VAT in Kazakhstan is 10% instead of 18%, or land tax in some cases is 0.2% from the cadastral value. So when businesses will think about where to go, they will be more likely reviewing other conditions in other regions, not only in this place. So they will be reviewing their location options and as well as other things. So we have to pay due attention to these issues. When we are talking about small businesses, then we should know that people should be able to start their business without getting involved into heavy communication with the state about it. So if a person has got an idea, he doesn't have to register himself first as a private individual and private entrepreneur and then to start paying taxes. First and foremost, he has to make one payment, which would include the patent cost and all other liabilities that he faces. So, in other words, he should have an opportunity to start his business just through buying a patent. That system is currently working in various countries, and we have explored options of introducing this system in our country. I wouldn't be talking details now. It is more about technical meetings with tax authorities.
Our second proposal, which was supported by the president, is the tax vacations for individual entrepreneurs. And again, for those who want to open their business for the first time and get registered as individual entrepreneurs or buy a patent, we offered a 2-year tax vacation where they don't pay anything. And with all the analytical backup, we saw that the state and the regions will lose nothing if certain conditions are followed, and then we will have a lot of new businesses which will additionally later pay taxes compared to the existing number of entrepreneurs, and then there will be some more income tax, and there would be some other tax coming into effect after the 2 year of vacations. And third is the voluntary nature of paying VAT for certain regimes. And there is some tax collision where VAT cannot be compensated, but then there are some significant factor in building relations between companies and those who follow the general tax rules. And these are three major initiatives which are currently promoted. And I believe that we have quite a different, significant substantiation of this. And it is debatable, but not in technical details. There should be other venues for it. And I would like to respond to Maxim's presentation. In principle, we support your concept of transferring this tax base to the property. And in the beginning of this decade, we spoke that the main source of your budgets should be tax on immovable property, those which is hard to hide and which are very well forecast. But we are very much afraid of the transitional period. And previously we had a mistake with the social tax, and there are several examples with the cadastral issue when the tax is not adequate to the market value of this land plot or the facility. And we have already several court cases, and therefore I urge my Moscow colleagues to be very careful and not introduce it immediately, but do it gradually, and first start it to a certain category of real estate projects, and then seeing that there is no harm in it, you can expand it to other group of companies or type of real estate. So to make it a pilot project, you can call it a pilot project, but a well-prepared, gradual approach when the cadastre appraisal has been discussed with individual independent appraisers, because they use different methods and there are different customers, and sometimes this value of real estate can be quite different. But last year we discussed with the relations between business and the state, and the entrepreneurs were having a tremendous number of claims that this cadastral value of real estate is inflated. And how can I comment on this? No, they cannot backdate the value of the cadastral value. We always actually determine cadastral value before the tax period, and then the gradual approach is also being implemented. Starting this year, we started the experiment for large facilities of more than 3,000 square meters of separately or located buildings. And for every company, a small company of 300 square meters, we also provided certain breaks. And if sometimes there are several facilities belonging to one company, say, but for large department stores, there are no smaller facilities, and therefore we have this following specificity that, say, parking lots cost as much as the trading area, and that's wrong. And we have prepared certain clarifications depending on the type of the real estate, and it will be debated with the business community, and definitely along with the next steps in expanding this experiment, by replicating it, we will offer all those solutions which we have in store and which the business suggests. And we learned for quite a long time without having water. And this is what Russians like to do. So we actually, the cadastre appraisals were approved, but nobody even looked in those lists unless nobody seriously understood that this law has been already introduced. And some businessmen were surprised and saying, where can we find this cadastre value of our property? All of this resource has been available for several years, and some big entrepreneurs, businessmen, were asking that children's questions about it, and therefore we need this bilateral street in exchanging, in dealing with our business community, and we are doing our best now with our colleagues. And the major achievement here is the introduction of new approaches and in doing business, in dealing with business, talking to business. We decreased the tax burden by 15% to the transitional period. Therefore, I can say that the business, once they actively interact with us, benefit from it. The only comment is that there are no prediction in it. It's very hard to say what will be the cadastre value in 5 years, what will be the tax. Well, about this forecast value, you see, there are some rates which are predetermined, and the cadastre appraisal is quite close to a market level. And in view of all the processes which we see, we are mostly concerned not about just keeping with inflation, but about going down of this price. And definitely there are a lot of nuances in it, but I believe that this year we will resolve most of these issues related to the cadastre value of real estate property items. And you are the ombudsman in protecting this interests of small and medium-sized businesses. And in your office, you have hundreds or thousands of letters with complaints or certain problems and some barriers they encounter. And how often the tax issue is mentioned in these letters or messages? Thank you very much. I heard very interesting proposals at this table. They're all correct. But what is our picture? Based on the report which we need to present to the president, and as for the tax, we need to formulate our proposals, which later will be turned into instructions to the government for the upcoming year. And what kind of picture we have based on the feedback from businesses? And the first thing is that most of the complaints relate to the local authorities and municipal authorities, and the quality of people working there is very low. And there are a lot of reasons there, and probably we need to the further away from Moscow, the poorer our budgets, and lower our skills of the people who work in this administrative bodies. Therefore, we will propose to the president that all taxes shall be left with municipal authorities, and there should be the law on physical property of persons will also be included and paid locally. But we also believe that not everything can be actually submitted at on one report. How to turn our tax system into a tool to encourage people to develop the businesses and stimulate the development of Russian economy, industrial sector in general. We believe that we need to divide business not by the organization, like open or closed joint stock companies, but individual entrepreneurs. We believe that there should be another form of classification. There are some businessmen which hire people who take loans, who are active in the industrial field, and this is one category. And the second is self-employed people, those who feed their families and themselves, and those who suffered most from our innovations, have no hired labor, and introduce this category. And when we have this goal in order to promote this active and energetic people, we also propose to introduce changes in ensuring patents for self-employed people without registration these people as individual entrepreneurs to simplify their existence. And besides, for certain activities, our proposal is where there is no patent can be issued to allow people to be self-employed and not to work in the gray sector and don't punish them for it. And we support generally your activities, but we believe that there is a room for certain improvements, and there should be differentiation on patents cost by territories, by location. And currently, in Moscow and in a small provincial city, the patent cannot be of the same price, and this is a significant barrier for many people in the province. And we would like to allow individual entrepreneurs to renew patents at any time or terminate their activity at any time of the year. It's important for them, especially for those agricultural or these areas and where they work only in a season or in a tourist business, where seasonality is a factor. Or the patents should be effective for just a limited period of time if no hired labor is not involved. And besides, and I say that in order to increase the employment in the SME sector, we need to provide tax breaks to all those who are recently registered as individual entrepreneurs, regardless of the activity. And this will contribute to minimizing the risks and give a chance to people to work actively instead of looking for state payments or pensions. And we believe that this will be quite beneficial, but we will not allow it for some repeated registrations. And administration is the key here, and I believe that the authorities shall have follow the rule that for 5 years they cannot make the conditions for a company's operation worse than it was previously. And we believe that the cancellation of the obligation of the check registration for small businesses and it should be renewed, and these small businesses should have a simplified mode of operation and without cash register slips. And the complaints coming from the outlying regions demonstrate us that some entrepreneurial people face significant barriers, and they are not encouraged, and they kind of disencouraged by the authorities. And we are waging on the discussion on the 15th of April. We will finalize this debate on our proposals to the president, and certain proposals certainly will be approved. Thank you very much. And the small steps probably will lead to incentivizing the entrepreneurship activities across Moscow and in Russia. But we compared conditions in Moscow and in those other regions of Russia, and do Russian entrepreneurs in Moscow certain privileges? Well, it's quite debatable. I will start with comparing business activities across Russia. All our rules are codified, and therefore in regions and the different republics of Russia, they have certain flexibility and imposing tax, and but still the picture is quite static. And another interesting thing is that, which cropped up just recently, it's designating these territories of of a rapid pace of development, I will call, and or exceeding pace of development. And in the Far East, there will be one of those areas with this tax haven for entrepreneurs, and it is quite promising. And we believe that there will be significant benefits for companies who wish to operate in the Far East. Talking about the international picture, and then definitely we have, as a company, we do certain research, different types of research, and we establish this scale of entrepreneurship activities across G20. And we can say that the Russian position there is not that bad. And we need to understand that we can talk about qualitative and quantitative parameters, and definitely all evaluations like this cannot be taken as cast in stone, but still they demonstrate certain tendencies. And our tax burden in Russia is not that bad if we compare it within G20. And in central columns, Russia is on the 9th place, and it is ahead of several industrially developed countries. And when we talk about tax burden, it's very important to define definitions. And we can say that there is some tax, but there are a lot of some fees or some costs which are not legally taxes, but because they're not included in tax code, but still are have the influence to the fiscal burden of the company. And a number of cases, a number of areas, this scope of burden is significant, and that increases the expenses of business, which are tax-like.
And with your permission, I'll carry on with my presentation, but there's just one question to be asked. At which indicator Russia ranks the first one? It is called support of entrepreneurship. When we mean this, when we talk about it, we mean that in the Russian Federation there is a big number of platforms which entrepreneurs use for unification. They unite together, and then on the basis of the platform, they communicate their ideas and feedback to the government. If we take a look at the chart again, you'll see that Saudi Arabia, for example, ranks the first in taxation. So all these ratings, like World Bank rating or similar ratings to that, they are based to a certain extent on a feeling on whether things are okay in a certain area. So we can debate whether we are okay or not. But as far as the support of entrepreneurship is concerned, we meant not only the governmental support, but more likely we meant the availability of the business structure that lets entrepreneurs communicate their ideas and feedback. You mean the structures like OPORA, ROSSII, or Victor's office? This is a good indicator of what has taken place within several years. Now we have several ombudsmen in the government who are responsible for defending entrepreneurs' interests. Thank you. Well, carry on. And talking about more specific things, I'm showing this slide in an attempt to tell you about certain things which will be worth your attention. But in my perception of reality, I tend to look more at the financial markets. This is what I'm dealing with historically, like with Alexander Voloshin, for example. I'm coordinating tax activities. And starting from 2015, we are planning to liberalize the tax percentages or cost percentages. It relates to the difficulty of calculating the proportion of cost in income. So it is not going to get worse. It's not going to get worse now. So those rules are meant to be quite liberal. We are returning to the practice of rebates to private individuals, rebates for stock options. This is important. For example, if you own a company and you know its stock, it will not be taxed for a certain period of time. We have also adopted a number of regulations allowing liberalization of long-term deals. And another thing worth mentioning is the fact that as far as administration is concerned, we are running a pilot for lateral monitoring of taxation process. It is important from the perspective of structuring trust-based relationship between business and government. Other things which might cause some concern include the offshorization. There are a lot of issues in this area which must be resolved. So the only thing is, and the only debate is about what impact it will have on business. So taking a look at medium and small business, then their opportunities are quite costly for these items. So in other words, this de-offshorization law will be more beneficial to big companies. Another issue, which is a concern for business people, is the likely change in decriminalization of the tax area. So we had quite favorable tax regime, and those plans which were announced last year and relate to expanding of investigation committee authority. So in line with this amendment, the Interior Affairs Department will be able to start cases based on tax evasion. So in this decriminalization area, we might have gone too far, so it has to be corrected. And finally, I would also like to mention some important things which matter for now. There are two subjects which were touched upon by Dmitry Shatalov today. First, the Finance Ministry is ready to acknowledge and introduce the mechanism of offsetting cost against income in holding companies. So that there will be a way to transfer cost between companies that will impact income rates in different regions, and it will impact certain companies' efficiency. So this is an important subject. But it is more important for big business, I think. But currently, we are on the Entrepreneurs Congress, and we have small and medium entrepreneurs here. This subject is just as important for small companies as it is for big companies, because small company can also work in line with this scheme, or a medium company. I agree it's not so important for small businesses. I think that there are a couple of other issues to be mentioned. Another concern is caused by the current debate that in the framework of the de-offshorization campaign, there will be a law about this offshore profits and revenues. So there probably will be a link between offshore tax avoidance, and there will be a link to the criminal law. So it is always difficult to talk about it when there is a perspective of a criminal case. But thank you very much anyway. And if you have any questions in the course of the presentation, please raise your hand. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. Good afternoon. My name is Andrei Leontiev, and I represent the Associations of Entrepreneurs from Samara. A question about tax breaks for new businesses, this 2-year tax break. You will lose a lion's share of tax if you do this. Let's say there is a family, a mother, a father, and a son. So some of these people can keep renewing the company. So they register their own company and they don't pay their tax share. And then the competition with companies who operate in good faith will be impaired. This is a standard question that has been discussed several times, and it was first asked by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So there is a number of answers to this question, and I've already touched upon this example from Ulyanovskaya area. Even when entrepreneurs have to pay small amount, they still find ways to pay zero. But when they made 5% instead of 15%, they have seen the 47% increase in the number of companies, given the fact that all others remained where they were. So it's just not good from the business perspective to play these games. And also in the law, there will be a number of measures designed to block this option. So what is a way to pay 15% from zero? How can you do that? What do you mean? How can you pay 15% from zero? There is a tax code. So it's a question to Maxim then. How come somebody pays 15% from zero, if you still have to pay at least 1% of your revenues. Well, zero, well, it was just a figure of speech, but 1% is very close to zero. But it's not that small. We have 6% and 1%. Well, since we talk about it, there's taxation which is based on costs offset against revenue. It is about production. And when we talk about production, that cost includes all sorts of costs, like, for example, utilities, communications, labor costs, taxes on labor, certification in working places, regular medical checks. So if we talk about all this, then production companies will be paying zero taxes because they have big cost. But getting back to what you say, like self-employed people, we come from Sisran. Self-employed are individual entrepreneurs. The individual entrepreneur sets up his own working environment, like sets up a small shop or starts selling handmade products. Who is, in your case, self-employed? This is the person who is currently operating in shadow, so he's not paying taxes and he violates existing regulations. And you say, let's create conditions for operating business. Let's get this business out of shadow. Let's give them preferences to these people. That's a fine thing to say. That goes about OPORA, ROSSII, and Business Russia. I haven't asked the question yet. So, as far as tax base is concerned, then if you pay contribution to the pension fund and if you are paying the unified imputed earnings tax, then you're not paying tax at all. You only pay to the pension fund. So what is this whole talk about? What are these tax preferences? Let's stop paying to the pension fund. Well, we in fact are not paying to the pension fund. Let's give Victor an opportunity to answer this question. Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank you for the way you speak, because I guess all public servants in Sisran are very frightened of you. You're a very strict person. But getting back to the core of your question, we always try, Russian people always try to look for somebody who is to be blamed, and they try to slap him in the face. Let's take a calm look at this business. When we started this conversation, we said that we will come up with a number of proposals who will help deal with a number of issues. We talk about tax breaks for production companies, because those tax breaks which were in place, they have been lifted now. We're not talking about all these things simply because there is not enough time to cover all these issues. So one of these issues is motivation of municipal authorities, because not only you have to prod municipal authorities, you have to stimulate them as well. And then you will see that there are people who are providing proper quality services. And you've asked the right question. When in Voronezh, President asked this question, there was no answer to it. And I said that all taxes, all municipal taxes should go to municipal authorities. And then these municipal authorities will be nurturing every individual entrepreneur. And don't mention corruption here, because it is very difficult to do something if we don't believe anyone. So if we give authority to collecting these taxes to municipal authorities, in other words, to small towns, then in those cases where people want to develop their economy, it will work and bear fruit. If people want to steal, they will keep stealing. But we need to give them an opportunity to work properly. They will create competition. And it is good. The more competition is there, the better. In well-developed countries, this sector of economy is giving up to 70% of revenue. Let's reduce the price for the consumer. Let's improve the services. Oligarchs are concerned about the future political influence of this group. Then this group inside themselves, they are concerned about dropped prices. Let me remind you about where we started from. We started with minus 600,000 of individual entrepreneurs in the beginning of this year. We wanted them out of this shadow, and the task is on our agenda. 600,000 of entrepreneurs have to be taken out of shadow, by all means. And it is not so much about the money as it is about the system. We do not have that many people who are capable of working. When you are telling me that all these people will be re-registering their companies in 2 years' time, but you're not answering my question. Can you please clarify your question? Why are you protecting the interests of self-employed people? Anyone can become an individual entrepreneur. You can do whatever you like. You can pay whichever taxes you like in line with the law. Why are you only talking about self-employed people? Not necessarily. You have the equal conditions. What is the difference between the self-employed person and the individual entrepreneur? Our ombudsman, I'm sorry, but I have to stop this discussion. Let's start with the fact that had you listened correctly to the presentation, there was a number of things mentioned in the speech. I support your activity, but please let us continue. Now we will get to a different issue now. Do we have any questions? My name is Veronika Ham, and I'm a tax consultant, and I'm an individual entrepreneur. My question is a bit different. It is more about the concept. I see a big problem. Business and government do not listen to each other. If you saw, business is asking for an opportunity for development, and the government is more interested in ensuring tax revenues coming in and observing social obligations. So the problem is the fact that Russian government and municipal authorities do not have a long-term consistent tax policy. And whatever is happening now is just a trial and error method. And business representatives at this round table are trying to hint that you need to listen to more. You need to listen more to our business representatives. But there is nothing more than a formal promise from the government to take this opinion into account. So here is a question to Maxim. Are you going to work out the sustainable tax policy which will take into account interests of business? I'm not talking about 5-year plan. I'm talking about tax policy for 20, 30, 50 years. Based on our experience, we can say that it is very easy to plan for 20, 30, or 50 years. It's difficult to plan for tomorrow, in fact. As far as consistent policy, I think that was the point of our discussion. That's exactly what we talked about. And I will put all these things together now, and I will try to answer your question. As far as patent is concerned and individual entrepreneurship status that Vladislav touched upon, and we talked about it, we talked about patents in relation to apartment renting business. I think there are no technical difficulties related to purchasing a patent and getting a status, a proper legal status at the same time. So had this been in place, we wouldn't be discussing these self-employment issues. Now we mentioned that small business is not interested in paying taxes. We have a monopoly for tax administration. So our tax service is a monopolist. So on the level of Moscow, we have worked out an efficient way to cooperate with the tax service. However, I understand that in Moscow, even in specific districts, it is difficult to build cooperation and interaction with tax authorities. And I can imagine how difficult it is to do that in some rural area far away from Moscow. I'm calling for adding this issue to the agenda, involving municipal authorities into the tax administration issues. Let's say municipal authorities should have authority to check whether the entrepreneur is abiding by the tax regulations. So it is not totally about the tax administration, it is about expanding the authorities of municipal government, and it is about increasing the motivation of the regional public servants. They will be motivated to develop their taxation base. And the question to business from my side. I think that all these issues related to tax simplification and tax breaks, you are talking about them in the light of business operating in good faith. We are in favor of this business, but at the same time we are creating these loopholes for those who do not operate in good faith. You are talking about this 1% tax, and we all respond differently to these issues. In the central district of Moscow, we have shops which sell flowers. They pay 1 million a year for the right to sell flowers. Well, at the same time, there are other shops who are not paying taxes and operating next door to law-abiding shops. We are trying to make them buy the patent for 120,000 rubles. So they operate on the basis of almost not paying taxes. So this is what this issue about. We have to level this tax burden so that those who are not operating in good faith, they will still have to pay taxes. Those tax breaks are debatable, but at the same time, we need to add one more issue here. Let's take the opportunity to use small business for the purpose of optimizing taxes of medium business. 60 million rubles is quite a high threshold. Let's say you have a 300 million turnover business, then you divide it in several parts and you pay 6% on your revenues. Our rent business is currently optimized in such a way, and we are trying to make sure that those who rent apartments will be paying taxes. We have already lost this 10% of tax revenues, when these tax revenues went to other areas of Russia, we have supported this decision because that's the right thing to do. It's the right federal policy. However, we have face obligations for city development, we face certain social obligations, and we have to compete with other cities in the world. So we have to have resources for that. And we will be getting this resource from the rent which is paid in Moscow, and I think that business people should understand that. They should treat it with understanding. Those people who do not pay taxes whilst getting revenue, they are not acting in good faith. I think this rent business is highly peculiar. Based on the information from the federal tax authorities, those companies which are not paying VAT, they're not used for tax avoidance and tax evasion. So these problems, they form a minor share of overall tax troubles. Mr. Mishustin has got all the calculations related to this issue, but we need to draw a line between these companies here. In Moscow, rent business is a highly peculiar business, and it is mostly about big business, so developers' business. So it is difficult to find a way what can be done to make sure that small landlords also pay taxes. When we investigated and made the calculation, we found out that the private individuals do not pose any risks for the budgets of all levels. Then we agreed that they probably should not be checked. We should focus on major tax risks, and within last 2 or 3 years, the federal tax authorities have made a huge step forward through reducing the number of tax checks and improving the revenues. One of our colleagues should not go to Switzerland without having her question answered, as with an understanding that we are not supporting production. I have your business card, and I just haven't touched upon these issues. We will put all these measures together, and we will send you a document focused on what is to be done in order to promote production business. We're just focusing on individual entrepreneurs to get these 600,000 people out of shadows. So I will be sending you this information, and I have your email. I would like to ask you to draw a line under what we have just said. Can you specify 2 or 3 things which can be done now in order to improve the tax climate and in order to foster entrepreneurship in Russia? Well, I'll get back to what I have mentioned in the course of my presentation. One of the things which will do a lot of good, I think it will be achieving more predictability in the tax area, and the best tool which we use in interacting with the finance ministry is there should be some approval prior to introducing the large-scale law. So more predictability. Thank you. Anything else? And like I said in the course of my presentation, there are 2 things: improving transparency of tax administration process and gradual improvement of tax stimulus, which will have positive effect. In my work, I take a look at P&L in a lot of times, in a lot of cases. Then I take a look at the business of different categories, and we take a look at which business faced the largest burden. In service companies who are paying big taxes for labor, in those cases, there might be a need to alleviate this labor tax burden so that the companies will be inspired to go forward. For production companies, like, well, that lady has asked a completely valid question. She was probably too emotional, because here in the Moscow government, we interact on a constant basis with different associations of entrepreneurs, and we work with them on a daily basis towards improving the tax administration system. And Maxim has just said it is easy to plan for 20 years, but it is quite difficult to plan the point of view to plan for the next day. So when we mention high competition, these companies who work in high competitive environment, they have large production costs, they have very small margins, and all the changes in tax regulations or the tax and all the changes of the market situation, they jeopardize business. So we suggest that we should change these things in a more gradual fashion. And also, I would like to say it is always very easy to complain and criticize. However, the format of our meeting shows that we have good dialogue with business people. We have several events of this kind a week when we meet business people and we interact with them. And I wouldn't want to kill individual interpreters, but if you have something good to offer, please contact us. We will employ you.
Two things to mention, and first of it is the officials shall be thinking not about the amount of tax and volume of payments, but how many businesses operate in their territories, what is the price of services, and what is the dynamic, the trend. If we achieve this indicator introduced in the job description, then we will have a better performance. And the second is our fiscal system shall motivate people to join economic activity, but not to join the official state structure. So that's a very global thing, and I would prefer some specific, concrete proposals with this regard. Vladislav Leontievich, yeah, and we spoke about one thing, and first is the returning to a citizen a constitutional right of waging business, and this is still not observed properly. And second, we need, once the patent is bought, it's one-time action, then it is a registration of individual entrepreneurship. That should be done in the civil code. And this constitutional right should be re-established. And the second point, important in my opinion, with regard to this tax innovation, probably, and I'm sure it will be implemented, it's a payment for the physical income of a person at the place of his or her abode. Thank you very much. What will be your summing up? I believe we need to define what will be the patent system in our and its administration, and the inevitability of paying tax. It shouldn't be big, but everybody should pay, and then it will kind of free the minds of officials to think about those indicators previously mentioned. Well, very good period, very good point to finish our discussion. And I would like to thank everybody for their participation and have a great evening. Thank you.